the early 1970s, scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology conducted a study regarding the world's consequences of exponential population growth with finite supply and resources. The study was termed the famous limits to growth. Essentially, they were answering the question, how long can humanity keep growing and consuming at its current rate? The study used the computerized simulation of the consequences of interactions between the Earth and the human systems. Put simply, they created a method to attempt to determine when the fall of society would take place. The findings were rather concerning. They concluded that the fall will be some point near the middle of the 21st century, around 2040, and so far their projections are accordingly on track. They examined the limited availability of natural resources and unseen inflation would subvert the expectation of economic growth in the second decade of the 21st century. Commissioned by the Club of Rome, the research became known as the limits to growth and focused on 5 basic factors that they claimed would determine and therefore limit growth on Earth. These were population, agricultural production, natural resources, industrial production, and pollution. This study has been widely ridiculed. However, the base expectations at this moment in time remain robust, and seeing the downward spiral in which the world is currently moving toward, ask a simple question of whether these claims are not too crazy after all. Even in 2008, the Australian Federal Government Scientific Research Agency concluded that the MIT forecast that the global ecological and economic collapse coming in the middle of the 21st century due to the convergence of peak oil, climate change, and food and water security is on track. It's important to determine exactly what is meant by a collapse. A collapse does not mean that humanity will cease to exist, but rather economic and industrial growth will stop and then decline, which will hurt food production and standards of living. Hence, this will of course bring about major societal issues across the world. The most infamous scenario forecast by the report says that by 2040, the world's economic growth would peak, but thereafter, the graph would take a sharp downturn. This will severely impact the global population with regard to food availability and natural resources. This imminent collapse will not end the human race, but the standard of human living conditions will degrade drastically. Now 50 years on, Gaia Harrington, who is a sustainability and dynamic system analysis lead at KPMG, reassessed the MIT study to observe the predictions made in 1972, and to her horror, there is a close alignment to all the predicted scenarios. Harrington wrote in her study that the scenarios indicate that continuing business as usual to pursue constant growth will not be possible after 2040. The limits to growth did not provide just one forecast. Rather, the authors explored several alternative paths based on different human strategies, and recent research by Harrington has shown that 3 of the 4 scenarios they outlined align quite closely with empirical data today. This is deeply worrying as 2 of the 3 scenarios suggest a major collapse by the mid-century, while the third entails a smaller decline. Harrington argues that humanity is on a path to having limits to growth imposed on itself rather than consciously choosing its own. We do have good news as the 4th scenario, which involves significant economic and social transformations, allows for widespread increases in human welfare within Earth's natural boundaries. The report's researchers agreed that achieving a relative well-being for all on a stable planet was possible. However, it required major changes to economic organization. In particular, it called for 5 major initiatives to eliminate poverty, reduce inequality, empower women, transform food systems, and overhaul energy systems by electrifying everything. But just look at one. The current global food systems are clearly flawed. They currently create unhealthy and unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, with the global north taking clear advantage of the global south. Even recently, the food systems of the world have been put under more stress by major shortages in wheat, corn, cooking oils, and rice, daily essentials needed around the world. I'm not going to go into all the initiatives that need to be addressed in order to prevent such a collapse to society outlined in the study. However, it's clear that all these areas are still major issues in the current global environment. This video is not intended to dissect every accurate prediction and limitation of this study. You look at today's society, we have wars, energy crisis, major food shortages, just to name a few. The world looks like it's approaching a major global depression if it's not already in one. The world is currently so bad that one could argue that we're currently experiencing a major societal collapse. Look at global energy crisis. Although a lot of the reasoning of an energy crisis is due to the current political upheaval, the supply is not equaling the demand, causing a very nervous and dangerous winter for millions. So where did the growth to limits prediction get it wrong? There certainly have been limitations and predictions that haven't quite come to fruition. Population growth has been slowing since the 1960s. In 1972, the world population was 3.8 billion and growing at a rate of 2.1% per year. In the following decades, some nations, notably China, intervened to slow growth, reducing the world growth rate to today's level of 1%. Currently, population levels, totaling nearly 8 billion, are actually declining in a growing list of nations, including Japan, Italy, and several Eastern European countries. Although more recently we have suffered from food insecurity at a larger scale, malnourishment has dropped more than half, from 35% to under 16% globally, from a report a couple years ago. Although many would argue that our air pollution is horrible, it's not as dire as once predicted. In China, over the last 40 years, 800 million people have come out of poverty according to the World Bank. These are just some of the valid points toward discounting such a doomsday scenario. Despite the limitations, you can just look at our current world and make an assumption that the prediction of a societal collapse for the 2040s is still very possible. Many research studies have found both evidence to prove and disprove the prediction. This video was not made to make a conclusion whether the prediction made 50 years ago is correct, but rather, many of the arguments from that study are worryingly accurate.